Imagine like pouring billions of dollars and years of effort into building this massive state-of-the-art highway system. It looks completely beautiful on the blueprints.
Well, sure.
The concrete is perfectly poured, the lanes are perfectly painted. But then once it's built and the ribbon is cut, you realize you totally forgot to check if the roads actually connect to where people live.
Right.
And worse, you forgot to build the off-ramps.
Yeah, so you just have this spectacular feat of engineering that essentially goes nowhere. I mean, you've generated a lot of motion, but absolutely zero practical progress.
Exactly. And usually when we hear about a failed mega project like that, our first instinct is to assume the builders just, lacked money or maybe technical skill. But often the real failure is much simpler and kind of much more invisible. Nobody ever stopped during the process to check if the thing they were building was actually going to solve the original problem.
Which is really a perfect metaphor for the absolute core of our discussion today. We are looking at this deeply analytical academic document by Reverend TikTok Beatrice and TOKJI Sebastian Deshi.
Yes.
And it's titled Notes on Evaluation of Christian Religion Education.
And for you listening, here is our mission for this deep dive. We're going on a journey to understand the underlying mechanics of how we build, how we judge, and how we refine the ways human beings learn.
Right.
We're going to start by pulling apart the actual machinery of educational evaluation and curriculum design. And then we're going to take those theoretical concepts and apply them to a massive, centuries-long case study.
It's a huge timeline.
It really is.
Yep.
We're looking at the evolution of Christian religious education, and we're going to track it from its roots in ancient Hebrew traditions all the way to modern Nigerian classrooms.
It is a remarkable lens, honestly. It allows us to watch educational theory play out not just in a vacuum, but across thousands of years of human history, shifting cultures, and, changing political landscapes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can look at the history of any specific curriculum, we first have to understand how we measure educational success in the first place.
Yeah, definitely.
And the source document, it really doesn't pull any punches here. It points out this staggering reality right off the bat, noting that in Nigeria, massive projects consume billions of naira. But because of a severe lack of proper monitoring and evaluation, those projects just routinely stagnate or they're completely abandoned.
What's fascinating here is the stark contrast the authors draw regarding how we view evaluation. Because in advanced educational systems, evaluation isn't an afterthought. It is a highly professionalized discipline.
Right.
An entire fields of academic study. But when a system lacks that rigorous built-in evaluation, you don't just get slightly lower test scores. You get a catastrophic waste of societal resources.
Yeah, it's a huge deal.
The text emphasizes this absolute need for accountability and evidence-based decision-making. Governments, parents, taxpayers, they all need hard evidence that an educational program is actually achieving its intended behavioral and intellectual outcomes.
Right. But I do want to push back on the word evaluation for a second, because I think for most of us listening, when we hear that word in an educational context, we immediately think of like a teacher handing out a multiple choice pop quiz.
Oh, absolutely.
But the text argues it's much more holistic than that. Like, it shouldn't just be a letter grade. For me, it should read the whole note for me. It needs to tell the whole story of what's happening with the student.
Yes, exactly. It is vastly more comprehensive than a simple test. The document cites an influential educator named Tyler, who defines evaluation as the process of determining to what extent the educational objectives are actually realized by the program.
Okay.
So it comprises both quantitative data, like those test scores, but also qualitative descriptions of a student's behavior, their critical thinking, and their practical application of knowledge.
So if evaluation isn't just a final exam, we can kind of go back to our highway analogy, or rather think of it like a GPS navigation system.
I like that.
Yeah, the text breaks evaluation down into three main types, which I thought was incredibly helpful. First, you have diagnostic evaluation. That's checking your starting point before you even put the vehicle in drive.
Yeah, what do the students already know?
Exactly. Where are their blind spots? You can't chart a course if you don't know the current coordinates of your learners.
Precisely.
Then you have formative evaluation. This is your GPS rerouting you during traffic. It happens during the instruction. It allows the teacher to catch misunderstandings in real time and restructure the lesson before the students are just completely lost.
Yeah.
And finally, you have summative evaluation. That's checking the trip log at the very end to see if you actually reached the intended destination.
That's a brilliant way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And the text takes that GPS concept even deeper by introducing Stufflebeam's CIPP model. That's CIPP.
Okay. What does that stand for?
It stands for context, input, process, and product.
I'll admit, when I read context, input, process, product, my eyes glazed over a bit.
It is very dry.
It sounds like corporate consulting jargon. How does that actually work in practice?
Fair point. Let's play it directly to your highway metaphor. The context evaluation is looking at the city's traffic data and realizing the core problem is that commuters just can't get across town.
Okay, so defining the actual need.
Exactly. You are evaluating the environment to define the objective. Then, input evaluation is looking at your budget, your engineers, and your materials to decide if a highway is even the right solution. Maybe you should build a subway instead.
Right.
Process evaluation is actively monitoring the construction. Like, are we pouring the concrete correctly?
Yeah.
And finally, product evaluation is measuring the final attainment. Did commute times actually decrease once it opened?
Ah, I see.
It treats evaluation as a continuous, unbroken loop of decision-making, not just a single, isolated event.
And crucially, the text points out that we have to judge these systems on multiple grounds. It mentions an author named Barha who laid out specific criteria for evaluating a curriculum.
Yes, Bajaj's grounds are essential here.
Right. The practical ground asks if the curriculum can actually be implemented with the resources at hand. But the one that really caught my attention was the sociological ground.
Oh, yeah.
It asks, does this education actually serve society and cultural needs?
Which is an incredibly loaded but, essential question.
Exactly, because I kept thinking, whose society? I mean, if a state-mandated curriculum serves the government's economic goals, but completely ignores the cultural values of the parents in a specific region, is that a success or a failure under Basha's model?
That tension right there is exactly why curriculum design is so complex. And it really forms the crucial pivot from merely evaluating a system to actually designing one.
Right.
If evaluation is the GPS and the ongoing diagnostics, curriculum design is the underlying architecture of the entire journey.
So let's look at that architecture. The text lays out 8 fundamental pillars, essentially 8 questions that educators have to answer when designing a curriculum. WHO are the learners. Why are we teaching them? What is the content? When should it be sequenced? How do we teach it? Where's the environment? How well are they learning, which is assessment, and how to improve, which is evaluation.
Those 8 questions guide the entirety of curriculum development, but you really have to notice the order of those questions.
Right, and this is where I want to pause because it challenges a massive bias I think most of us hold. If you ask the average person what a curriculum is, they will almost always describe the what. They'll describe the textbook, the reading list, the syllabus, but this source adamantly argues that the WO and the why must be established first.
Because without the WO and the why, the what is entirely meaningless.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, handing an advanced calculus textbook to a kindergartner is technically providing content. You are delivering the what, but it's not education.
Yeah.
Because you fundamentally ignored the WHO.
Exactly. And this ties perfectly back to Baja's sociological ground. A curriculum must be deeply responsive to the learner's actual developmental stages, their cognitive abilities, and the realities of their daily lives.
Yeah.
If you don't clearly define the overarching purpose, the why we are educating these specific people for this specific society, then any content you deliver has no structural foundation.
So if that's the theoretical architecture, the necessity of answering WHO and WHY before deciding the what, how does that actually play out in the real world?
Well, the text gives us a great example.
Right. It gives us this massive historical case study to see these principles tested under extreme pressure. Let's trace the evolution of Christian education, starting with the ancient Hebrew traditions.
It's a fascinating starting point because it forces us to look at an educational model long before formal institutionalized schools even existed.
Yeah.
The early Hebrews were semi-nomadic and later agricultural. Their education was fundamentally theological, but it was entirely communal.
The text cites a famous mandate from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7. The instruction for parents to teach their children diligently when sitting in the house and when walking, by the way.
Exactly.
It's a model where the parents are the primary educators, and the classroom is quite literally the rhythm of everyday life.
It was an informal, deeply integrated educational model. But a massive paradigm shift occurred during the 6th century BC, during the Babylonian exile.
Right.
The Jews were conquered and cut off from the temple in Jerusalem.
Which was the entire epicenter of their religious and communal life.
Precisely. For centuries, their religious practice was centered around geographic, physical sacrifices at the temple. Suddenly, in exile, they needed a substitute.
Yeah.
They needed a place for communal identity and instruction that didn't rely on being in Jerusalem. And that immense sociological pressure births the synagogue.
And the shift from temple sacrifice to synagogue text study is arguably one of the most important intellectual pivots in history, right?
Oh, without a doubt.
Because they essentially draft the architectural blueprint for the modern classroom without realizing it.
They absolutely do. The synagogue transitions the community from a ritualistic focus to an educational focus. It became a center for public scripture reading, complex exposition, and prayer.
Wow.
Over time, they realized they needed a structured way to bring children into this highly text-based community. So they developed a layered, tiered school system that feels remarkably familiar to us today.
Walk us through those tiers, because the text breaks them down specifically.
Sure. First, you had the Bet HaSefer, or the House of the Book.
Yeah.
This was primary education, largely for boys, focused on learning to read the Torah. Then you had the Bet HaMidrash, the House of Interpretation.
So like a high school.
Exactly. It was essentially secondary school, moving beyond basic literacy into complex exegesis and debate. This is the exact level of intensive study the Apostle Paul would have engaged in under the scholar Gamaliel.
Okay.
And finally, the yeshiva, the house of study, which was advanced, immersive discipleship with a rabbi.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text points out that when the early Christian church formed, they didn't invent a new educational model. They essentially copy-pasted this exact synagogue blueprint.
They really did.
The rhythm of gathering, reading a text, debating its meaning, and praying became the foundational template for Christian instruction.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that this early Christian education was incredibly ambitious in its scope. It was highly holistic.
Yeah.
Before the New Testament was even fully compiled, they were delivering a multifaceted curriculum. They taught doctrinal content, establishing the nature of God. They taught liturgical content, shaping how to worship.
Right.
They taught apologetic content, giving believers the intellectual tools to defend their faith against sophisticated Greek and Roman philosophies. And vitally, they taught ethical content, the famous two ways tradition, which starkly contrasted the way of life versus the way of death.
So the what of their curriculum was vast, but the how was still deeply rooted in community belonging. It wasn't just sitting at a desk. I mean, it was identity formation.
It's exactly.
But obviously, if you walk into a public school or university today, it doesn't look like a first-century gathering. So how do we get from this localized, community-driven model to the highly structured, state-run mass schooling we recognize today?
For that massive leap, we have to look at the 16th century and the explosion of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther didn't just initiate a theological revolution. He accidentally triggered a global educational revolution.
How so?
Because Luther insisted on the doctrine of sola scriptura, the idea that religious authority comes from Scripture alone. And that created an immediate practical problem.
Right. If authority comes from the text, then every single believer needs to be able to read the text.
Exactly. Luther vehemently demanded that all Christians needed to be literate. He actually petitioned German princes to establish publicly funded schools for all children.
Wow.
And crucially, that meant boys and girls, which was a staggering, highly democratic vision for curriculum access at the time.
And you see that exact same text-driven momentum carry over the Atlantic with the 17th century Puritans in colonial America. The text brings up a piece of legislation from 1647 in Massachusetts.
Oh, yes.
And I have to say, it possesses perhaps the greatest, most intense name for municipal law in human history, the Old Deluder Satan Law.
I imagine modern school board meetings would be vastly more entertaining if we still named legislation that way.
Seriously. But the mechanics of the law are fascinating. It required towns of a certain size to build schools and hire teachers, specifically so that citizens could read the scriptures and therefore avoid being tricked by the devil.
Right.
Oh, and the text also notes that Harvard College was founded in this exact same era with the primary curriculum designed to train literate ministers.
And that drive for mass literacy only accelerates. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution is pulling families apart and putting children into factories.
Yeah, child labor was rampant.
Exactly. In response, you see figures like Robert Raikes founding the Sunday school movement in England. This wasn't just a quick moral lesson before church service. It was a massive, pragmatic effort to provide basic literacy reading and writing to working-class children who were laboring 6 days a week.
That's incredible.
It really became one of the most successful mass educational projects in modern history.
So what does this all mean? For you listening, think about the incredible irony of this historical thread. When we look at the foundations of modern mass education, the push for universal publicly funded literacy, and the establishment of elite institutions like Harvard systems we now view as largely secular, they were all fundamentally born out of a desperate religious desire to read the Bible.
It's a profound sociological reality. And as the source document notes, moving into the 20th century, we see this field become highly professionalized.
Right.
We see the rise of formal seminaries, the massive educational influence of the Second Vatican Council, and very importantly for the final leg of our journey, the rise of African independent churches. Yes. These AICs began intentionally integrating deeply held African cultural values with Christian teaching, representing a massive shift in how the context of a curriculum is respected.
Which brings us perfectly to the tension of our final segment. Because if this Western, heavily literacy-focused curriculum was born out of the European Reformation and the Industrial Revolution, what happens when you take that exact same educational machinery and drop it into 19th century West Africa?
You get an incredible, highly complex friction of curriculum design. In the 1840s and 1850s, Christian missionaries representing Anglican, Presbyterian, Catholic, and Methodist groups arrived in Nigeria.
Okay.
Their stated goal was dual-natured. It was to evangelize and to introduce Western civilization.
And the specific curriculum they brought was known as the 4 R's: reading, writing, religion, and arithmetic. Now, if we apply Baha's evaluation criteria to this implementation, the legacy is incredibly multifaceted.
It is. The source document presents a very balanced, impartial look at this friction. Structurally, the contributions were undeniable. The missionaries brought massive linguistic standardization. They were the ones who formally wrote down and preserved major languages like Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa. They built hospitals, facilitated infrastructure, and helped suppress intertribal conflicts.
But sociologically, the text explicitly notes that this European curriculum was severely misaligned with the environment it was placed in.
Yeah, that's the core issue.
The traditional indigenous education was heavily practical, agricultural, and communal. But the missionary schools emphasized Western intellectualism and aimed to actively separate children from their parents' traditional practices.
Exactly. Returning to our 8 pillars, the missionaries imported the what and the how from Europe, but they failed to accurately evaluate the where and the who of the Nigerian context.
Wow.
And this friction wasn't just cultural, it became intensely political. In the north, the British colonial officer Lord Lugard had promised to protect the existing Islamic structures. So through ordinances in 1916 and 1918, the colonial government actually intervened and stopped providing grants to mission schools in the north to halt the spread of that specific Western Christian curriculum.
It's a literal collision of educational models.
Yeah.
You have the indigenous practical education, the Islamic education in the north, and the Western missionary education pushing from the south.
It was a very turbulent time.
It created such a systemic crisis that between 1922 and 1925, the Phelps-Stoke Commission was formed to investigate.
And if we use our terminology from earlier, the Phelps-Stoke Commission was essentially executing a massive systemic summative evaluation.
Checking the destination.
Exactly. They looked at the product of this educational highway and realized it wasn't connecting to the reality of the people. Their ultimate conclusion was a plea for an education that actually adapted to the children's real environment and their practical roles in society.
So why should you, the listener, care about how a curriculum was debated in the 1920s? Well, because the ripples of that friction are still dictating policy today.
Oh, very much so.
The text points out that currently the philosophy of Christian religious education in Nigeria is officially tethered to the 5 national objectives of the country, adopted by the National Policy on Education.
Yes, the system is explicitly tasked with helping to build things like a free and democratic society, a just and egalitarian society, and a strong, self-reliant nation with a dynamic economy.
Right.
The curriculum has been officially conscripted to produce citizens capable of realizing national macroeconomic goals.
This raises an important question. How well does an educational framework with its structural roots in the 19th century missionary movement and going all the way back to the ancient synagogue actually serve the 21st century learner in a modern, highly pluralistic nation?
And answering that question is exactly why evaluation cannot just be a final exam. It demands continuous application of Stufflebeam's CIPP model. If an educational program is not constantly reevaluating its context, questioning its inputs, refining its process, and honestly measuring its product against Baja's sociological grounds, it risks becoming that beautiful highway with no off-ramps. Historical momentum is not a substitute for reaching the right destination for today's society.
That is the multi-billion naira insight right there. Okay, let's take a breath and recap the sheer ground we just covered.
We began with the deep mechanics of evaluation, defining it not as mere testing, but as a holistic, continuous loop of diagnosing problems and ensuring societal needs are met.
Right.
We explored the architecture of curriculum design, proving that knowing the WHO and the WHY must always dictate the what.
We then watched those theories endure the test of time. We traced education from the intimate daily life teachings of the ancient Hebrews into the text-based community of the synagogue, a model the early church completely adopted. We tracked how Luther's demand to read the text fueled universal mass literacy, and how Puritans and industrial-era reformers inadvertently laid the groundwork for modern schooling.
Finally, we applied all of this to evaluate the complex implementation of Western education in Nigeria by 19th century missionaries.
Yeah.
We analyze the profound friction that occurs when a curriculum's what doesn't match the sociological who and where of the learners, and how modern nations are still trying to align historical curriculums with modern economic goals.
It is a phenomenal historical sweep, and it leaves us with something really important to think about. When we looked at the ancient world, education was deeply, inseparably intertwined with family, daily chores, and the literal survival of the community.
Right.
You learned your ethics and your history while walking down the road with your parents. Today, education is highly institutionalized, it is rigorously professionalized, and it is evaluated by government agencies against national economic benchmarks.
It's a completely different landscape.
It really is. So here is a final thought for you to ponder long after we sign off today. We have clearly gained massive technical capabilities and universal access, but what do we lose when education becomes a purely state-run program to be managed rather than a community's shared way of life?
It's a profound tension, and one we are clearly still trying to resolve today.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.